My name is Karim Nader Al-Hassan. To those who hear it at first, it might seem like just another common name from the Arab world. But for me, that name has always been a burden. It wasn't just an identity. It was like a suit of armor I had to wear every day. An armor that reminded me at every moment of who I was supposed to be to others, and not of who I really was inside. I was born into one of Bahrain's most traditional and influential families, right in the heart of the capital. I grew up in an environment where power, prestige, and control weren't just values, they were almost like the oxygen we breathed. My father, Suleiman Al-Hassan, was a feared and respected man, Minister of the Interior for decades and a direct cousin of the king. Living in his shadow wasn't just about carrying a status title, it was about bearing the weight of a legacy that brooked no flaws, that demanded constant perfection. From birth, expectation and power were present in every detail of my life. Yes, I grew up surrounded by luxury, but I also grew up surrounded by silence. The silence of the cold marble walls of our palace. The silence of glances that spoke louder than 1,000 words. The silence of orders that were never spoken aloud, but which everyone knew exactly how to obey. Our house was called Qadara, a true fortress hidden behind imposing walls, with symmetrical gardens that seemed drawn with a ruler and guards at the entrance who never betrayed any emotion. My childhood was carefully shaped to fit a rigid pattern carved by generations before me. From an early age, I knew my blood carried weight. I was the direct heir to a line of royal advisors, religious leaders, and princes who, over the centuries, shaped not only the politics, but also the spirituality of our people. Have the surname thank you was like carrying an invisible throne on one's shoulders. It was a silent call to absolute fidelity, to Sunni tradition, to the honor of the dynasty, and to complete submission to the power structures. My routine was a dance of rituals and obligations. Between religious ceremonies and intense studies, my days always revolved around what the family valued most: control, reverence, and appearance. The palace had more than 30 rooms, 3 gardens that looked like true works of art, always tended by gardeners from Turkey and Sri Lanka, and even a private prayer room where my father, with a firm voice, led Friday prayers when we weren't at the Grand Mosque, Al-Jamal. Even as a boy, I understood that any action I took could bring eternal honor or shame to my family. There was no room for error, but there was one place where I breathed a little freedom: the British school in Hamla. It was there, surrounded by classmates from different parts of the world, that I began to feel for the first time that perhaps there was a life beyond the armor they forced me to wear. In those British school corridors, I felt as if the world breathed lighter, more colorful. It was like a small window opening onto the walls of Qadara. But this feeling was short-lived. As soon as the bell rang, I knew that at home, hours of rigorous study with private tutors awaited me. They reinforced lessons from the Quran, classical Arabic, the history of the caliphates, and all of Sunni culture. Learning British English was also mandatory. My father said we represented the country with every gesture, every word, and that I should be impeccable before the world. But when I crossed the palace gates, everything changed. English was left behind, and the only language allowed was the formal, almost poetic Arabic used by generations of my family. It was like a constant reminder that our roots could never be forgotten. It was in this contrast between two realities that I began to realize as a boy that there was something inside me that didn't fit in. We traveled frequently: London, Geneva, Dubai. But none of it was rest. Each trip was merely an extension of family responsibilities. The whole world seemed like a stage where we had to uphold the perfect image of our lineage. We wore traditional clothing even in Western countries. People stared at us, commented, and I felt every detail was scrutinized. Our bearing, our words, everything screamed Bahraini Sunni elite. As the eldest son, I was molded with extreme care to take my father's place. Even before I learned to write my own name, my future had already been decided. Religion in the home went far beyond personal devotion. It was part of power, a symbol of order and authority. Every morning, even before sunrise, we were awakened for the Fajr prayer, and each of the other prayers of the day was performed with almost military precision, as if God only listened to those who followed protocol to the letter. But for me, faith was never about intimacy. It was an invisible uniform I was forced to wear. I prayed, yes, but I prayed with fear. Fear of getting a word wrong, fear of displeasing, fear of embarrassing my family. There was no room for doubt, questions, or weaknesses. Everything had to be perfect, rigid, and aligned. But even amid so much discipline, a restlessness began to grow within me. It was a silent but persistent voice telling me there was more. much more than what I'd been taught as absolute truth. Friday, for example, was never just the end of the work week. For us, it was a sacred, untouchable day. Skipping the sermon wasn't seen as a distraction, but almost as a silent betrayal of the pillars of faith and the honor of our family. I vividly remember walking alongside my father to the Grand Mosque Al-Noor in the heart of Manara. He always had a reserved seat in the front row, surrounded by ministers, influential imams, and men of power. And I, small and sitting next to him, had to maintain my posture, my gaze steady, and my heart racing because I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon us. Those looks weren't just of admiration. They were inquisitive looks, judging every detail, from the way we wore our robes to the tone of our voices during prayers. It was as if every gesture was evaluated and measured, as if the value of our blood was at stake at every moment. From a very young age, I understood that questioning all that was tantamount to disappearing. So I obeyed. At just 6 years old, I was already memorizing the Quran inside the palace itself. To this day, the voice of my former tutor, Imam Rashid al-Mahur, still echoes in my memory. He recited verses from Surah Al-Baqarah with an almost military firmness, and I, small and tense, struggled to repeat each syllable without fail. It seemed that any error, no matter how small, was not just a fault in pronunciation, but a flaw in my character. At night, after silent meals and the ever-watchful gaze of the Imam, I would kneel before the Imam to pray. My heart was heavy, my mouth dry, and every word I uttered was measured as if it were part of a judgment. If my intonation wavered, correction was immediate, with no room for compassion. In that environment, religion was no bridge to God. It was a rigid code of conduct with no room for weakness. The name of our palace, Kadara for me, never meant home. It was in fact a gilded prison, where everything was controlled, monitored, and timed. Every gesture seemed to have an invisible manual, and the older I grew, the narrower those walls became. When I turned 13, the demands intensified. My father felt it was time to toughen my character, so he handed me over to the care of an even tougher mentor, the dreaded Zik Nabil al-Khazra, the direct representative of the Sunni Caliphate in Moscow. His mere presence was enough to make grown men bow their heads. He was a tall man with a deep voice, as if every word came from the bowels of the earth. His face was marked by deep wrinkles, scars from a lifetime of discipline and austerity. But what intimidated me most were his eyes. Eyes that seemed to pierce my masks and reach the places I tried to hide even from myself. Twice a week he would appear at the palace to give me private instructions. Just knowing he was coming made my stomach knot, taking my breath away. On these visits, he didn't just test me. He pressured me, confronted me, as if he were shaping red-hot iron. He corrected my Quran recitation with ruthless coldness, treating every small slip-up as an unforgivable flaw. And it wasn't just corrections. Questions also came. He interrogated me about the most complex hadiths as if I were already a grown man. Each time I hesitated, he repeated a phrase that stuck with me like a branding iron. You are not just a Muslim. You are the son of Suleiman. Your mistake is not yours alone. It affects the name of an entire nation. Those words pierced me like thorns. I carried a guilt I didn't even know where it came from, but it never left me. Over time, questions began to arise within me. They came softly, almost like whispers, and I tried to stifle them. But they were there. Why were the punishments in the Quran so severe, so cruel? Why were non-Muslims treated as natural enemies, unworthy of God's mercy? I wanted to understand, but no one would let me speak. I knew all too well the fate of those who dared raise these questions. I had cousins who, upon expressing doubts, were sent to Islamic boarding schools in Kuwait or Pakistan. The family said it was to correct their minds. In practice, it was an imposed exile. In that environment, there was no room for spiritual seeking. There was only blind obedience. Even the walls seemed to have ears. Silence was the only form of safety. From the outside, our lives were an impeccable showcase. Swimming pools that reflected the sky like mirrors, luxury cars lined up at the entrance like sculptures, expensive clothes that cost more than a foreign worker could earn in years. But inside, everything was empty. There was an invisible weight, silent chains tightening my chest day after day. And this weight didn't just come from the rules. It came from the meaning that always seemed to be missing. The greatest weight wasn't the palace walls. It was the weight of living a life that wasn't mine. It was the constant stare, the suffocating expectation of being perfect, even when inside all I wanted was to simply breathe. Be human. Be free. The surveillance system had no cameras, no alarms. It was silent. It was everywhere, in every gaze. I felt it in my father's eyes, in the community's demands, in the imam's sermons, in the rules that hovered over my every step. In the month of Ramadan, fasting was not just an exercise of faith, it was a public spectacle of discipline. Every hour of the day, it seemed the entire country was watching us, ready to point out any weakness, any slip-up that could be construed as deviance. It wasn't just about pleasing God, it was about pleasing all those who claimed to represent Him. My father used to take us to Majlis al-Aman, a center of spirituality and Islamic teaching in the north of the country. There, the feeling of being watched became even more intense. The weight of appearances and reputation was crushing. Other families looked at us with a mixture of respect and demand, as if we were a living portrait of piety, an impeccable example of obedience. But inside we barely breathed. Every gesture was rehearsed. Nothing could deviate from the script. I'll never forget a night that left a deep impression on me. I was only 14 when my father ordered me to lead the Taraweeh prayer for the palace servants during Ramadan. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the Quran, even though it was a small, lightweight copy. But at that moment, what truly terrified me wasn't God's presence. It was the paralyzing fear of forgetting a verse, of mispronouncing a syllable, of embarrassing my father in front of so many watchful eyes. The fear of failure overwhelmed any sense of devotion. My entire life was a theater, a stage of obedience to my family's will, the king's authority, and the religious system that controlled even our innermost thoughts. I tried to believe it all made sense. I was trying to convince myself it was the right path. After all, from birth I'd learned that doubt was the first step to ruin. And in that reality, ruin wasn't just rejection. Ruin could mean complete destruction, social, spiritual, and even physical. As a teenager, a strange emptiness began to grow inside me. It wasn't physical pain, but a dark space in my chest, a lack of peace that deepened with each passing day. We constantly learned about Allah's mercy, but in practice, what echoed most from the pulpits was the weight of divine wrath. Hell was the most prevalent theme. Paradise, however beautiful it was described, seemed distant, unattainable, reserved only for the impeccable. The slightest slip-up was treated as a sure path to perdition. I remember the various Islamic camps I attended in Muharraq at that time. Meetings were always marked by tension, warnings, and doctrinal vigilance. Jihad, heresy, and the danger of questioning traditions were discussed there. But above all, the fear they planted most in our hearts was the fear of apostasy, abandoning the faith. This was treated as the worst of all abominations. I'll never forget one particular night. A visiting preacher, a tall man with a thick beard and a voice that cut through the silence, took the pulpit with a stern expression, and with a few words he set the room ablaze. He quoted, in a menacing tone, a verse from Surah Al-An'am. "If they stray, seize them and kill them wherever they are." Those words fell on me like stones, and to this day I remember the cold shiver that ran down my spine. Those words didn't sound like a divine warning to me. They slammed into my chest like a death sentence. I remember nights lying awake in bed, listening to the cold hum of the air conditioner, staring at the ceiling and wondering, what kind of merciful God would order someone's death just for changing their beliefs? I never dared share these thoughts, not even with my cousin, Fair, who would later become a colonel in the Bahrain Defense Forces. From a young age, he was a symbol of absolute loyalty to faith and country. I, on the other hand, hid my doubts deep within myself. I buried each question beneath mountains of memorized prayers, rote repetitions, and empty rituals. It was like trying to silence an inner scream with religious noise. My soul begged for something more, for air, for space, for truth. But I only responded with greater rigidity because that was what was expected of me. When I turned 23, in everyone's eyes, I was the perfect portrait of an exemplary young Muslim. I already knew more than half of the Quran by heart. I was constantly called upon to lead short sermons at Friday meetings in the palace's private prayer room. My posture was firm, my voice assured, my appearance impeccable. My father watched me with a mixture of pride and expectation, as if he saw in me the direct extension of his own life, the spiritual and political heir who would carry on his legacy. But what no one saw was the abyss within me. Every word I recited, every verse extolling the glory of Allah, echoed in a deep void. It was as if my mouth spoke, but my heart remained silent. And this was the great paradox of my life. The more I claimed to love God, the more distant I felt from Him. I often woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, my heart racing, feeling trapped in an endless play, a cycle of repetition, fear, and pressure. I silently wondered, is it possible to truly love a God I only knew through fear? A God who seemed more interested in punishing than listening? That question, which I never dared to say out loud, was the spark that began to change everything. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. It was one of the most solemn dates in the Islamic calendar, a celebration so sacred it seemed to bring the entire city to a standstill before God. We were in the Grand Mosque, an imposing place filled with marble columns, the scent of incense in the air, and sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Hundreds of men knelt, lined up like an army, bowing and murmuring prayers in perfect unison. For many, this was the height of spirituality. But for me, it was different. That day I felt disconnected. It was as if there were a glass wall separating my soul from everything happening around me. I saw, I heard, but I didn't belong. I was a stranger among my own kind. It wasn't contempt nor disrespect. I just knew deep down that I no longer belonged in that world. I grew up among carpets and minarets, between fasts and recitations. But something inside me had broken. At that moment, I realized my faith was no longer faith. It was just a rehearsed role, a theater I had to play to survive. I continued to pray, to recite with firm intonation, to lead ceremonies with precision. But each gesture was just a mask, a shield against the abyss screaming within me. And abandoning that role wasn't an option. In my world, that didn't just mean rebellion. It was practically signing one's own death warrant. So I kept smiling in public, feigning confidence, while inside I sank deeper and deeper into silence. I continued to bend my knees before the sacred, even when my heart was no longer there. Inside there was a silent revolt, a trapped scream, a dark hole where not even God seemed to enter. The only true memory of peace I have from that time, within the heavy walls of the palace, occurred on a special night when my younger sister turned 16. She was different. She was always the beacon of light in that stifling environment. Intelligent, curious, full of life. As if her soul had found a way out through the invisible cracks of the prison where mine was chained. That night she appeared at my bedroom door. Her eyes were bright, filled with burning questions. She sat on the edge of my bed and with the innocent courage only daring young men possess, asked, why was a woman's word worth half that of a man in court? Why would her inheritance automatically be less than mine? That disarmed me. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that question, but it was the first time it came from someone I loved deeply, someone who believed in me. I tried to repeat the answers I'd learned since childhood, about emotional balance, about the complementary roles God had given each gender. But as I spoke, I realized my words sounded hollow, like memorized phrases from a dusty book. Even to me, they sounded like excuses. She smiled sweetly, thanked me and left, leaving a heavy silence behind her. But the question remained. It echoed inside me. For hours I stared at my Quran, the same one I used for formal recitations, leather-bound and gold-edged. I couldn't bring myself to open it. It was that night that I realized. I didn't revere that book out of love, but out of fear. And there my doubts began to take shape. They were no longer just vague sensations, but concrete questions. If this was indeed God's absolute truth, why was there so much room for injustice? Why did fear seem to be the main link between us and the Creator? Why did divine love always seem so distant? I didn't yet know where it would lead me, nor how much it would cost. But in that silent dawn, I began to search. Not with my mouth, but with my heart. And it was my heart that began to set out on pilgrimage, transcending the walls of the mosque, the palace, the very weight of my surname. The conversation with my sister Layla, it was like pulling the first loose thread out of an old rug. A small, almost invisible thread. But over time, with each prayer said without feeling, each verse recited without belief, that thread began to unravel, and the emptiness inside me grew like a shadow I could no longer ignore. I'll never forget one night during Ramadan. It was just before the sahur meal. I had just led the Taraweeh prayer with my family and the palace servants. Everyone else had already retired to their rooms. I was alone in the main prayer hall, a gigantic space covered in handmade oriental rugs, with verses from the Quran inscribed in gold on the walls, and a huge crystal chandelier on the ceiling that, when illuminated, looked like a frozen galaxy suspended above me. And yet, in that place that was supposed to represent the presence of God, everything inside me felt suffocated, as if the air had been knocked out of me. It was as if, for the first time, I was seeing that room through the eyes of my soul, not through the eyes of ritual. All the external beauty of that scene could no longer hide the inner darkness that consumed me. It was a moment of silent rupture. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just knew something had broken forever. That night I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't ask for anything. I just sat there still, listening to the silence. And without realizing it, also hearing the first whispers of a God I hadn't yet known. The air in that room seemed denser than ever. The smell of imported incense, that sweet aroma that for years I'd associated with spirituality and routine, suddenly began to suffocate me. It was as if it had stuck to my skin, mixed with the sweat and fatigue I carried. But it wasn't a physical fatigue, the kind that a shower or a night's sleep can cure. It was a much deeper weariness, a weariness of the soul, an invisible exhaustion of sustaining a life that wasn't mine. I no longer prayed out of faith. I prayed because I had no other choice. He recited verses because I was expected to. And even though I knew every intonation by heart, every precise pause, what came out of my mouth no longer came from the heart. Deep down, I knew, even without admitting it, that it was all just an act. And it was a well-crafted performance, I admit. From the outside, everyone applauded me as the ideal son, the exemplary Muslim, the heir to an honorable lineage. But inside, I was just a fragile, empty shell, carrying on my shoulders a name that no longer held meaning for me. The silence of that hall, considered sacred for so many years, had become a cold echo for me. I cried out not for the presence of God, but for the absence of meaning. And paradoxically, it was precisely in this emptiness, in this deserted space between doubt and pain, that something began to change. I was alone, leaning against one of the cold marble columns of the prayer hall. I closed my eyes and tried desperately to find some peace, even if it was hidden in the farthest corner of my soul. I didn't hear voices. No heavenly visions appeared before me. There was no lightning or thunder. What I felt was subtle, yet incredibly real. It was like that moment before a summer storm, when the wind dies, the air grows heavy, and the hairs on your body stand on end inexplicably. It was a silent anticipation, as if something grand and yet dangerous was about to happen. The atmosphere around me seemed to have shifted. What had once been an oppressive void now seemed filled with something invisible, yet alive. A presence. Not an idea, not an imagination, but something real. So real that it surpassed any prayer I had ever uttered. My first impulse was pure terror. After all, since childhood, I was taught to distrust any spiritual manifestation that wasn't controlled and explained by the traditions of Islam. And what had I learned from that early age? That such experiences could be the work of jinn, invisible, dangerous and deceptive spirits. My teeth began to chatter involuntarily. My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I waited for a threatening whisper, for a cold touch on the back of my neck, for any sign that the presence was evil. But none of that happened. That presence wasn't cold, nor violent. It didn't carry the fury I'd heard so often in Friday sermons. It was strong, yes, there was authority in it, an undeniable authority. But at the same time, there was no condemnation, there was no judgment. It was as if she saw me completely, with all my sins, my doubts, my weaknesses, and yet she didn't reject me. And that was precisely what disarmed me the most, because until that day, I had never experienced anything like it. I remained still, leaning against the column, as if any movement could shatter the moment. My eyes remained closed, not out of devotion but out of fear of what I would see if I opened them. My entire body was tense, prepared for an attack that never came. Sweat trickled down my forehead and mingled with the silent tears that fell. They weren't just tears of fear but of confusion, of realizing that everything I believed in seemed to be crumbling. I tried to hold on to the structures that had always given me security. I did what I had learned since childhood. I mentally recited the verse of the chair, the verse of the throne, considered a shield against all evil and any spiritual attack. But to my surprise, those words that once seemed to carry so much power now sounded hollow. It was as if they were echoes of a language I no longer understood, like shouting underwater, soundless, powerless, ineffective. The presence didn't retreat, but it didn't speak either. It didn't shout, it didn't demand anything. It just stood there. And in that silence, so charged with meaning, more terrifying than any noise, I began to think I was going mad. Was this a trial from God meant to test my endurance? Or was it a deception from Shaitan, as so many religious leaders had warned since my childhood? But deep down, none of these explanations made sense, because for the first time, I didn't feel the fear I'd been so often taught in sermons about eternal damnation. What I felt came from somewhere else. It was as if my soul was beginning to recognize something my mind couldn't yet explain. The question that began to well up inside me was no longer, who are you? But yes, why do I feel loved anyway? What happened there wasn't a cruel test, nor a trick of my mind, nor a hallucination. It was real. So real that it surpassed all the religious experiences I'd ever had. It was as if time had stopped, as if the palace, the rules, the religion, and the rituals had been suspended. Only that presence remained with me in that sacred and strange silence. It can't be explained in words. It wasn't something I saw with my eyes or touched with my hands. It was as if it observed me from within without invading me. It simply saw and touched me, not my body but my soul, as if it were caressing a wound I didn't even know existed. Then something happened. Until that moment, that presence had been like a mountain, immobile, immense, static, but suddenly it moved. Not as if walking or physically approaching, but as if a warm breeze in the late afternoon, like the surface of a lake being touched by the wind. What reached me wasn't a hand, nor a voice. It was a wave of peace, an invisible touch that pierced all my defenses and reached the only place where I still harbored a spark of hope, my heart. And as that happened, the fear began to recede. The tension that had paralyzed me began to melt away like a wall silently crumbling. And in its place, something new began to emerge. It wasn't pain, it wasn't guilt, and surprisingly, it wasn't judgment. It was as if someone with infinite patience was helping me look inside myself, as if saying without words, "I know where it hurts, I see you, and I won't look away." That presence didn't come to punish me or shame me. Instead, it exposed me with compassion. It was like opening locked windows within me, revealing parts of myself that even I had hidden. But it did so with such gentleness, with such love, that the only response I could muster was to cry. And it was in that cry that everything reached its peak. For the first time, I saw my own pain. I saw my loneliness. I felt the weight of years of playing a role. All the agony of the questions I'd kept quiet out of fear. The sadness I carried because of my sister, Layla, for her purity, for her hope, for her courage to question. It was as if everything came flooding back at once, but not like a destructive avalanche. It was as if that presence was saying to me, "I've always been here. I've never stopped seeing you." And it completely undid me. I grew up believing in a God who was more judge than father, more fire than light, more punishment than welcome. And suddenly there I was, stripped of all my masks, and yet embraced. I, who always thought that weakness, doubt, or falling were grounds for condemnation, discovered that in that instant I was being found. It wasn't punishment. It was redemption. This revelation tore at my heart like nothing before. The fear that had haunted me for so many years dissolved like smoke carried by the wind. And in its place was born something new, so profound and so real that it made me tremble. It was peace, but not just any peace. Not the absence of pain, not the denial of chaos. It was peace in the midst of chaos, peace in the midst of the storm. It was as if someone said very quietly inside me, "You are not alone. I know you. I never stopped loving you." Those words changed everything. I, who had lived my entire life under the weight of the Imam's stern gaze, under my father's relentless demands, under the constant fear of a God who seemed to watch only to punish. In that moment, I was completely seen with all my flaws, my hypocrisies, my silent rebellion. And yet I was not rejected. On the contrary, I was welcomed. What enveloped me there wasn't a love earned by good works, nor conditioned by appearance or performance. It was a pure love, without demands, without masks. A love vaster than the deserts of the Gulf, deeper than any recitation I've ever given. I cried. I cried like a child, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were tears of relief, of surrender. It was as if after so many years my heart finally breathed. As if that presence had touched something locked inside me and with that touch opened a dam. And everything I had kept bottled up for so long began to come out. Even with my eyes closed, a kind of dialogue began to take place. Not in words, not like in books, but something direct, soul to soul, spirit to spirit. And then the images came. Not with my physical eyes, but as if they were visions etched into my chest, illuminated by a light I had never known. It was as if they were being projected into me, not in chronological order, but as an emotional map of my entire life. I saw myself as a child, frightened, my hands trembling as I led the prayer for the first time, trying to hide my fear. Then I saw myself as a teenager, suffocated by doubts I never dared ask, those forbidden questions that consumed me inside. Then I saw myself as a young adult, a stranger in my own home, crushed between the weight of family expectations and the uncomfortable truth that lived in my heart. And in each of these scenes, that presence was with me, not as a harsh judge, but as an embrace, not as condemnation but as comfort. A compassion so intense it seemed to whisper, "I was with you through every tear no one ever saw." There was no accusation. There was no relentless voice telling me, "You should have believed more. You should have doubted less." There was only silence full of understanding, as if that presence shared with me the pain that I believed I carried alone. This shattered every concept I had of God. I was never taught to see him as someone capable of weeping alongside his child. To me, God had always been presented as a distant, stern king, a sovereign who demanded unconditional obedience. But there in that silent room, I discovered that he was not a tyrant. He was a father who suffers alongside his son. And it was at that moment that everything started to change inside me. That silent dialogue, which until then had only reflected my past, began to touch on areas I'd never dared to explore. Forbidden questions surfaced, including that dark doubt that had haunted me since adolescence. The verse that commanded the death of those who abandoned the faith. The answer didn't come in clear words. It came in the form of a pain so deep it seemed to tighten my chest, a knot that almost made me gasp for air. It was like feeling a father's sadness at seeing his name used to justify so much hatred, so much violence, so much death. It wasn't a theological explanation full of difficult terms. It was a direct, simple correction that cut to the core of my being. And suddenly the truth became as clear as sunrise. I understood in that instant that any teaching that promotes cruelty, fear, or contempt cannot come from the true essence of God. The love I felt there was pure, immense, capable of illuminating all the darkness that fanaticism had created within me. Suddenly, everything I'd built for 27 years, that rigid castle called Islam with its suffocating rules, the constant fear of hell, and the hierarchy of power, crumbled like sand blown by the wind. And in place of that suffocating prison, something entirely new was born. A living, breathing presence. It was freedom. A freedom I had never known before. The freedom to no longer be afraid. The freedom to question, to doubt without being consumed by terror. There I understood that my relationship with the divine did not depend on my perfection or the mechanical fulfillment of rituals. It depended on grace, a grace that reached me even in my failures, even in my doubts. Carefully, I opened my eyes. My surroundings looked exactly the same. The cool marble, the luxurious carpets, the golden calligraphy covering the walls. Nothing had changed on the outside. But inside, something inside me would never be the same again. The same walls that once imprisoned me now seemed to embrace me, as if I had finally found refuge. The God of my childhood, distant, severe, merciless, died within me that night. And in his place blossomed a truth that didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't impose itself. It was a gentle, firm, liberating truth. A truth I simply loved. A truth that entered my soul and remained. I was loved. Loved completely and unconditionally. It didn't matter what I had done or failed to do. That love didn't depend on merit, appearance, or perfection. And this revelation changed everything inside me. I sat on the cold floor of that hall, still leaning against the icy marble column. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time no longer mattered. My body, which had previously trembled with fear and tension, was now calm, heavy, almost anchored to the ground. I looked down at my hands resting on my knees, and they felt strange, as if they weren't mine. And in a way they weren't. The man who had entered there a few hours earlier, full of fear and emptiness, was gone. I was exhausted, but it was a good kind of exhaustion. The kind you feel after crossing a scorching desert and finally finding shade and fresh water. I took a deep breath, and the air that entered my lungs felt different. Light, pure, full of life. The scent of incense was still in the air, but it no longer weighed heavily on me. Now it was just an aroma. Nothing carried that suffocating weight it once had. The gold, the carpets, the recitations. Everything had lost its oppressive mystique. It was then that I understood. True power lay not in externals, nor in rituals or traditions. It lay in that living presence that still pulsed within me, in that silent love that transformed my soul. And it was at that moment that the inevitable question arose. Not from my mind, but from my awakened spirit, from that place within me I didn't even know existed. Who found me in that darkness? I tried to seek refuge in the mold of the faith I was raised in. I remembered the 99 names of Allah I had learned as a child. Ar-Rahman, the merciful, Al-Wadud, the loving one, Al-Ghafar, the forgiver. Yes, that presence had all of that, but it also had something much more. Because those names, as beautiful and sacred as they were linked to the God I had learned to fear. to the rigid system that suffocated me. All my life I had been taught that God's love had to be earned, that it would only come through effort, discipline, and blind obedience. But what I experienced that night was something completely different. It wasn't a distant forgiveness sitting on a stern throne. It was compassion that delved into my pain. It wasn't the love of a king for his subject, but the love of a friend. Someone who sits beside you, holds your hand, and cries with you. And suddenly I realized that none of the names I knew were enough. None of them could contain the ocean of love and grace that was flooding me. The image of God I had was too small, too limited, incapable of expressing the greatness of that love that was completely disarming me. With my heart exposed, I understood clearly. That presence was not a jinn as I had feared, nor the cold and severe God that my father Ibrahim always taught me to fear. But then, who was it? My heart begged for a name, something I could call upon, be thankful for, acknowledge. And then the answer came. Not loudly, not in thunder ripping through the heavens, but in a silent whisper, etched directly into my soul with an indelible force, Yeshua. When that name echoed within me, it was like a ray of light illuminating a dark room, revealing something that had always been there but that I had never seen. It wasn't a new idea, but for me, it felt like the first time. That love gained a face. The presence gained a name. Yeshua. He was the key, the missing piece in the puzzle of my heart. The source of that love that shattered me to rebuild me better. A love with a name that sounded like a profound revelation. A shiver ran through my body, but it wasn't fear. It was the shock of truth. A truth so intense and overwhelming that it shook all my certainties and turned upside down everything I thought I knew about faith, God, and even myself. Yeshua. Jesus. The central figure of that path I had learned to despise, reject, even hate. The faith I had always been taught to call heresy, the greatest sin, the absolute transgression. For us Muslims, this was the line that should never be crossed. And yet there I was, Fars, son of Ibrahim, raised in a devout and rigid lineage, bent over backwards before a revelation that seemed almost a betrayal. My mind collapsed, as if two completely opposite worlds collided within me. How could I accept that the purest, most real and sacred experience of my life was linked precisely to a name that, for me, symbolized the greatest error of faith? It was a cruel paradox, a contradiction that tore me apart piece by piece. But no matter how much I tried to deny it, no matter how much my reason fought against it, that love was still there, firm, unshakable, and it had a name, Yeshua. Even amidst the confusion, there was something impossible to ignore. The love I felt was real. The peace that filled my heart was real, and the name that echoed in the depths of my soul was real too. I sat there in the heavy silence of my father's palace as that word rang within me like the deep toll of a sacred bell. In that moment, two certainties struck me like a bolt of lightning. Life as I knew it was over, and true life, the one that truly matters, was just beginning. Gradually, like a gently receding tide, that intense presence began to diminish. It didn't disappear suddenly, nor did it dissipate like a passing wind. It was as if that immense wave of love and peace had transformed into a gentle flame, lit right in the center of my chest. Silence once again filled the prayer hall, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was a full silence, charged with a subtle vibration, as if the air still held the memory of what had just happened. I stood up slowly. My body felt heavy, strange, as if the skin I wore was no longer the same. I looked at the Quran open on its carved wooden stand. Hours before, that book had been the absolute center of my world, the indisputable and literal word of God. But now it seemed merely a sacred object from a life that was no longer mine. Beautiful, yes, respectable. But my heart no longer responded to it. The disconnect was profound, almost painful. I needed to get out of there, return to my routine, to the role that had been imposed on me since birth. But how could I put on that mask again, knowing the face behind it had changed forever? Every step I took from that place plunged me into an abyss of doubt and uncertainty. Only this time, it wasn't the fear of an angry God that paralyzed me. It was the fear of men, the fear of my father, the fear of my family. Every shadow on the walls seemed to watch me. Every distant noise sounded like a whisper of threat. The ground beneath my feet seemed to utter a silent sentence. I had become the keeper of a dangerous secret, a secret that, if revealed, could destroy everything. If my father, with his unshakable faith and ever-suspicious gaze, had even suspected what had happened in that hall, the price would have been too high. I, Karim Al-Hassan, would have to face the consequences of having found Yeshua in the sacred heart of our own home. And it wasn't just a shame or dishonor to the family. It was a death sentence. The people I loved began to pass before my eyes, but their faces were no longer the same. They ceased to be familiar figures and became stern judges, relentless accusers, invisible executioners. The luxury and splendor around me, which once brought me a certain comfort, now became a gilded prison, a fortress where my soul was the loneliest prisoner. The grandeur of the palace had become a labyrinth with no exit, and I, lost within it, carried a secret that crushed me. When I finally entered my room and slammed the door shut, I felt like a fugitive who had found a temporary hiding place, a fragile refuge from the outside world. I walked to the large ornate mirror above the dresser and stared at my reflection. It was my face, yes, but my eyes, they were different. Those empty eyes, marked by the weight of fear, were gone. In their place was a mysterious gaze, a deep calm but mixed with absolute fear that pulsed through my veins. The weight of that revelation was almost unbearable. I knew I couldn't tell anyone. There was no one to trust, no one to turn to for help or advice. I would have to continue living a double life, pretend to the world that everything was fine, continue praying in public, reciting the prayers steadfastly, maintaining the image of an exemplary Muslim. But now the hypocrisy had become even heavier. The hypocrisy, which had previously merely concealed my lack of faith, had now become something much greater and crueler. I was no longer merely concealing my inner emptiness. I was hiding something infinitely more dangerous, the presence of a forbidden faith, faith in Jesus. To my family, my culture, and my religion, this was betrayal. A secret so heavy it felt like it was sickening me, eating away at my soul. It was then that the call to prayer, the adhan, echoed through the window, coming from Raya's distant minaret. That sound that had once comforted and summoned me, that day became my first great test. My body reacted automatically, as if on autopilot. I went to the bathroom, carefully performed the ritual ablutions, and rolled out the rug toward Mecca. But every gesture turned into silent torture. Every word of the prayer burned in my mouth like a bitter lie I was forced to utter. When I mechanically declared, Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest, my mind was no longer with the God of my childhood, that rigid, distant God. It was with the one who had revealed himself to me as Yeshua, the God of love, compassion, and mercy. While reciting the Surat Al-Fatiha, the opening prayer of the Quran, I felt an emptiness grow within me. I perceived myself as an imposter, a traitor, kneeling in a space that no longer belonged to me. It was like desecrating the most sacred experience of my life with falsehood. As I prostrated myself on the ground, the weight of loneliness crushed me. I was alone, completely alone in this new secret journey I had begun. And yet, amidst the fear, loneliness, and chaos, there was a silent flame that continued to burn. A quiet, almost imperceptible peace remained firm within me, like a constant whisper. You are not really alone. The days that followed were the longest of my existence. The palace routine continued unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Punctual prayers, family meals, social engagements. But I moved like a wind-up doll. Every mechanical gesture, every rehearsed word hid the storm raging within me. Every conversation with my father was a minefield. I answered his questions about politics, religion, and the future of our people with short, vague, and shallow sentences. The fear that he would see the truth in my eyes consumed me. The sessions with the Sheikh Al-Marad became a kind of refined torture for me. Sitting before him was like being naked before someone who saw into my soul, as if searching for any crack in my mask, any sign of weakness or betrayal. He spoke fervently about the immaculate purity of Islam and the dangers of Western influence. I just nodded, pretending to agree, while inside my heart was racing, ready to leap out of my chest. Everything around me, which had once seemed solid and reliable, was now crumbling. The food had lost its flavor. People's voices became distant echoes, and I sank deeper and deeper into that suffocating loneliness. I began living with a constant ringing in my ears, like an anxious noise that never left me alone. It was as if I were constantly walking on the edge of a cliff. My whole life seemed about to fall apart. My body was tense, as if at any moment the ground would open beneath my feet and I would fall into the abyss of truth I could no longer deny. Amid this overwhelming anguish, an urgency arose within me, a hunger stronger than fear. I needed to understand what had happened to me. I needed to know more about him, about Yeshua, that name that had awakened something in me that I never knew how to explain. But I also knew that in that palace, privacy was a non-existent luxury. Every sound, every click could be heard, watched, monitored. Searching for answers was almost like committing a silent rebellion against everything I knew. I waited until dawn, until the house was completely silent. Only when I was sure everyone was asleep did I lock my bedroom door, something I'd never done before, and sit down in front of my laptop. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst from my chest. I opened an incognito tab, my fragile shield against the invisible eyes that might watch me, and typed the words that could cost me my life. Yeshua, Jesus, who do Christians believe in? It was like opening a dam. An avalanche of information began to flood me. Centuries of history, theological debates, heartfelt testimonies. Everything challenged the simple negative narrative I'd heard since childhood. It was like being trapped in a dark room and suddenly realizing a door had opened to an infinite library, an unknown and fascinating universe. Every click was a risk. Every reading, a secret revolution within my soul. Alone, I crossed a narrow, dangerous portal called the internet. And it was there that my life began to change forever. It was on this uncertain path that I encountered the Gospels. On a simple, almost amateurish website, I discovered the entire Bible translated into Arabic. Hesitantly, but driven by that inner hunger, I clicked on the Gospel of John. The first words hit me like a punch in the chest. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I stood motionless before the illuminated screen in the darkness of the room, absorbing every word with a thirst I'd never felt before. It was as if the text had been written especially for me, for that moment of despair mixed with hope. But that Jesus wasn't the same one I knew from Islamic texts, where he appeared as just another prophet among many. No. There he spoke with a voice that was both tender and full of authority. A voice I immediately recognized, because it was the same voice that had met me in the prayer hall, the same presence that had touched my heart and transformed my soul. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Each sentence was like a silent confirmation. Each verse fit perfectly like the missing piece in the puzzle of my heart. What I read was not some strange or distant doctrine. It was a direct reflection of my experience, what I had felt in the depths of my soul. The way Jesus treated the marginalized, his patience with the confused, his radical love for the lost. It all rang familiar, true. He wasn't an idea. He wasn't an abstract concept. He was real. It was him. During the day, I continued to be Karim Al-Hassan, heir to the Sunni lineage, fulfilling the role my family and my religion demanded. I participated in religious discussions, recited the Quran perfectly, and maintained the image of an exemplary devotee. But at night, I was no longer the same. During the day, I still wore the guise of a devout Muslim. But at night, when the lights went out, I became someone else. A hidden seeker, a clandestine reader of the Gospels, a thirsty heart that found hope in the words of that man called Jesus. Every verse I read was silently shaping who I was becoming inside, even if no one around me suspected. I clearly remember one afternoon at school when the Sheikh al-Marathi spoke with conviction about how Jews and Christians had corrupted their scriptures. He quoted verses from the Quran with conviction, and outwardly I just nodded silently, pretending to agree. But inside, I felt like the worst hypocrite, carrying in the silence of my room a secret that could destroy me. This same secret, which was beginning to free me, was also costing me dearly. The weight of living a double life became increasingly unbearable. It was a crushing burden, growing stronger by the day. The fear, which had once been just a distant shadow, now became a flame, ready to consume everything around me. I knew I couldn't go on like this for much longer. Behind me, the past was already burning, destroying everything I knew. And ahead of me lay only unknown territory, dangerous and lonely, a path I would have to walk alone. But just the thought of having to choose between these two worlds paralyzed me. It was like being at an inevitable crossroads. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. I was in my room, immersed in the book of Acts, captivated by the stories of Jesus' early followers and their unwavering faith. I was so engrossed that I made a mistake I'd never made before. I left the door unlocked. A small detail, but in that situation, it spelled danger. Suddenly, I heard firm, familiar footsteps in the hallway. It was my father. Panic gripped me. I slammed my laptop shut so hard it felt like it would break. Seconds later, the door opened. He walked in with a calm smile, wanting to talk about a trip he was planning. But I could barely breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it was trying to burst out of my chest. He looked at me with an expression that mixed suspicion and concern and asked if I was okay. All I could say was that I was tired. He nodded, said goodnight and left. closing the door behind him with a calmness that to me was almost cruel. I stood motionless, staring at the closed door, my entire body trembling like never before. The dim light from the laptop still flickered, reflecting my fearful, tense face. Those seconds felt like an eternity. If he had come in a moment earlier, he would have seen the gospel verses on the screen, and my secret would have been exposed. At that moment, I realized the danger was no longer a distant threat. It was real, immediate, deadly. If they found out, it would be the end. My life would be at risk. When silence returned to the hallway, I slid to the floor, leaning against the side of the bed, trying to control my breathing, which seemed out of control. I felt hunted by something invisible, crushed by a shadow that suffocated me. It was an invisible weight, but as real as the cold ground beneath my feet. And it was in that moment of profound despair, without planning, without any ritual, that I did something unprecedented. I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to speak to him. For the first time in my life, I said a sincere prayer, a simple prayer, without memorized words, without masks, without fear. Just a cry from my heart. I whispered in the silence of the room, my voice trembling. "Oh my God, I can't take it anymore. I can't keep living this lie. They'll find out and it could cost me my life. Please help me. Show me the way. I'm lost. I don't know where to go." It wasn't a pretty or well-structured prayer. It was the desperate cry of someone broken, of a child lost in the darkness. But it was there, in that delivery, that something changed inside me. In that moment, I stopped being just a curious Muslim. In that moment, I became a true follower of Jesus. That night, I surrendered my life, my fears, and even my uncertain future into his hands. The answer didn't come in the form of a voice or grandiose signs. It came as an unexpected peace that cut through my despair like a gentle blade. Within me, one word echoed clearly: to go out. It wasn't a cowardly escape. It was survival. I suddenly understood that I couldn't stay there. I didn't have the strength to face my father, my culture, that suffocating environment that crushed me alone. The only way out was to leave. Just the thought of leaving everything behind broke my heart. My mother, my brothers, and most of all, my sister, Layla, the only one who seemed to see my silent shadows. The pain of imagining this separation cut me like a sharp knife. Staying meant continuing to live a lie, increasingly dangerous, an invisible prison that suffocated me more each day. Leaving, on the other hand, required renouncing everything: my history, my name, my identity. I would have to abandon the comfort, prestige, and privileges my family had given me to become a stranger in the world, a fugitive without a face, without roots, without a home. I looked around the room where I grew up. That luxurious space that had once given me security now felt like a tomb, a silent mausoleum that held my past and my pain. It was there, in that heavy silence, that the decision finally loomed before me: to remain in a status-adorned illusion or to plunge into the unknown, dark, lonely, but real. The choice didn't come with applause or visible signs. It came with the firm silence that followed my prayer. The fear was still there, squeezing my stomach like an icy knot. But beneath this layer of fear, a quiet peace blossomed. The same peace I had felt in the prayer hall. An inexplicable calm that enveloped and strengthened me. It was as if an inner voice told me, "Yes, this is the way. The price will be high. You will lose much. But what you will gain is infinitely greater: your soul." That night, without hesitation, I began to act. Every movement was careful, calculated, guided by a strange mixture of adrenaline and serenity. I opened my secret safe, took out my passport, and gathered all the foreign currency I'd saved over the years: euros, dollars, pounds. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get me started. I returned to my laptop, but this time, not to seek spiritual answers. I opened a digital map and began studying borders, routes, and flights departing from Manara Airport. Each click was like dismantling my old life. Each decision, an act of faith mixed with desperation. My escape began to take shape exactly 48 hours after that night of anguish. I used a simple excuse: a quick trip to Dubai to visit a friend. The lie slipped out of my mouth so naturally it even scared me. No one suspected anything. At 3 o'clock in the morning, with a small suitcase containing only the essentials, I walked through the silent corridors of the palace of Qadir for the last time. Each step was a farewell, an echo of the life I was leaving behind. The entire palace slept, oblivious to the silent betrayal unfolding beneath its own roof. As I passed Layla's bedroom door, I hesitated. My hand hovered in the air as if I wanted to wake her, tell her everything, beg her to come with me. The urge was almost irresistible, but I knew I couldn't. The pain was unbearable, but I knew I couldn't drag my sister to that uncertain and dangerous fate. That would be condemning her along with me. I choked back tears, feeling a lump in my throat as sharp as a blade, and continued walking. I didn't leave a note. I didn't look back. I simply crossed the back of the palace, got into the car I discreetly summoned, and disappeared into the darkness of the night. I wasn't just fleeing a country. I was fleeing an entire life. And the silence of my departure was perhaps the last gesture of mercy I could offer to those I loved so dearly. The drive to the airport was a whirlwind of emotions. Every police officer on the road, every glance from the security team seemed like a constant reminder that it could all end right then and there. My heart was racing, my chest feeling like it was about to explode with tension. But I knew this was the only chance to live the truth that now burned within me. I expected at any moment to feel a firm hand land on my shoulder, hear someone shout my name, and see the entire plan crumble before my eyes. But it never happened. I went through security, passport checks, and finally arrived at the boarding gate. My destination was Larnaca or Cyprus. I chose it almost at random. Close enough to escape quickly, but far enough away to feel like a completely different world from the one I was leaving behind. As the plane took off, tearing through the night sky, I felt as if my roots were being ripped out along with the earth that was left behind. I looked out the window and saw the lights of Manara spreading, shining like a delicate network of diamonds, until little by little everything became just a distant, silent memory, kept deep in the chest. It was then that the tears I had held back for so long finally fell. They weren't tears of fear. They were tears of grief. I wept deeply for all I had lost, but along with the pain came a strange, intense relief, a feeling of freedom so profound it almost hurt. I was free. Yes, free, but completely alone. Today I find myself in a strange country, living in a small apartment that barely holds my memories. I wait anxiously as bureaucrats decide on my asylum application. My future remains shrouded in uncertainty. The asylum process is long, tiring, and full of humiliating moments. I have plenty of time to think, and all that adrenaline from escape is behind me. Now all that's left is the harsh, stark reality. I lost my family, my home, my name, I lost everything. And yet what I received in return seems to many insignificant. Just a memory. One night. A silent presence in a prayer room. Something impossible to prove to anyone. If I told this story to a psychologist, I might hear words like stress, breakdown, hallucination. And honestly, I wouldn't blame them. Because how can one rationally explain a presence made only of love? A conversation without words. A name whispered in a silence so profound it doesn't imprint itself on the mind but on the soul. It's an invisible mark. A scar that no longer hurts but never goes away. It's become a part of me. After that night, I never had any more visions or voices. It was a unique, silent, and frightening encounter. But sometimes in the silence of the early morning, when everything is calm, I can almost feel that peace again. And I remember why I left it all behind. Most of the time though, it's just me, Karim, a man with no defined past, with a future still uncertain, trying to learn to live one day at a time. I don't have all the answers. I don't know why this happened to me. I don't know why, among so many, I was the one who experienced it. All I know is that that night, in the most unlikely place anyone could imagine, I found God. Or maybe He found me. And that encounter cost me everything: my home, my name, my history, my family. But it gave me exactly what I needed most. The rest is still a mystery. Perhaps it will remain so for a long time. This is my journey. From prince in a palace to refugee seeking peace. And even without all the answers, today, for the first time, I breathe like someone truly free.